Steve Rogers stood at the edge of the Hudson River, watching the sun rise over Manhattan. The shield on his back felt heavier than usual this morning. Not physically. The vibranium remained as light as ever, but emotionally. Each scratch on its surface told a story of sacrifice, of choices that haunted his dreams. The call came at dawn. Maria Hill's voice carried urgency that made his stomach clench. "Steve, we need you at the Triskelion. Now." 20 minutes later, he walked through corridors filled with whispers and worried glances. SHIELD agents who usually greeted him with respect now looked away. Something had shifted in the night, something that threatened everything he stood for. Nick Fury waited in the briefing room, his single eye darker than usual. Beside him sat a man Steve didn't recognize, elderly, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide the tremor in his hands. "Captain," Fury began. "Meet Dr. Marcus Whitfield. He was part of Project Rebirth." Steve's blood ran cold. Project Rebirth was supposed to be classified beyond top secret. Only a handful of people knew the true details of his transformation from frail Brooklyn kid to super soldier. Dr. Whitfield looked up with eyes full of regret. "Captain Rogers, I'm sorry to say that everything you know about your creation is a lie." The words hit like a physical blow. Steve remained standing, but his world tilted sideways. "What do you mean?" "The serum that made you wasn't Dr. Erskine's formula alone. We combined it with something else. Something we took from others." Whitfield's voice cracked. "We used DNA extracted from enhanced individuals we captured. People we experimented on. People who died screaming in our labs." Steve's hands clenched into fists. The shield suddenly felt like it might slip from his grip. "That's impossible. Dr. Erskine would never." "Dr. Erskine didn't know," Fury interrupted. "The military added the stolen genetic material without his knowledge. They wanted to ensure the serum worked. They were willing to commit any atrocity to create their perfect weapon." The room spun. Steve reached for a chair, his enhanced physiology doing nothing to steady the earthquake in his chest. Every mission, every life saved, every moment he'd worn the uniform with pride. Was it all built on murder? "How many?" he whispered. Whitfield couldn't meet his eyes. 17 confirmed deaths. Maybe more. We took samples from enhanced humans we found. Mutants, mostly. Teenagers who couldn't defend themselves." Steve thought of all the young mutants he'd fought alongside over the years. Storm, Jean Grey, Bobby Drake. Kids who'd shown him kindness and respect, never knowing that their suffering might have contributed to his existence. "There's more," Fury said grimly. "The families of these victims have hired the best lawyers money can buy. They're filing war crimes charges. International courts are getting involved. And they have evidence. Evidence. Physical proof of atrocities committed in his name." Steve felt sick. "They want you arrested, Captain. They want you stripped of citizenship and tried as a war criminal. The president is under pressure to comply." Steve stood slowly, the shield sliding from his shoulders. For the first time in decades, he couldn't bear its weight. The star that had represented hope to millions now felt like a brand of shame burned into his soul. "The victims' families will be holding a press conference tomorrow," Whitfield continued. "They'll present their evidence to the world. Photos, medical records, death certificates. All of it points back to Project Rebirth." Through the window, Steve could see protesters gathering outside the building. Signs demanding justice. Families holding pictures of the dead. Young faces that would never age, never laugh, never love. All because the military needed a super soldier. "What do you need from me?" Steve asked quietly. "We need to know if you're going to fight this," Fury said. "The evidence is damning, but it's not perfect. A good legal team might be able to create reasonable doubt. You could claim ignorance, which would be true." Steve shook his head. "I won't hide behind lawyers and technicalities. If I'm responsible for their deaths—" "You're not responsible," Fury interrupted. "You were a victim too. They used you just like they used those kids." But Steve couldn't hear the words over the screaming in his head. 17 young people had died, so he could become Captain America. Every life he'd saved since then was paid for with innocent blood. How could he call himself a hero when his very existence was an atrocity? "I need time to think," he said. "Steve," Fury called as he headed for the door. "Whatever you're considering, don't do anything stupid." Steve paused at the threshold. "Fury, stupid is the one thing I've never been accused of. But right now, I'm not sure what smart looks like anymore." He walked out into a world that no longer made sense, carrying the weight of 17 deaths and a shield that might no longer be his to bear. The morning sun that had seemed so bright an hour ago now cast shadows that reached across his entire life, revealing truths he wished he'd never learned. The burden of honor was about to become heavier than vibranium. The press conference began at noon, broadcast live across every major network. Steve watched from his apartment in Brooklyn, the same place he'd grown up when he was 90 pounds of determination and nothing else. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah Chun, the lead attorney representing the victims' families, stood behind a podium covered with microphones. Behind her, 17 photographs formed a memorial wall. Young faces frozen in time, their lives cut short by experiments that created him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chun began, her voice steady but filled with controlled fury. "Today we reveal one of the darkest chapters in American military history, Operation Enhancement, a classified program that ran parallel to Project Rebirth." Steve's hands trembled as she spoke. Each word was a nail in the coffin of everything he believed about himself. These 17 individuals were abducted between 1940 and 1943. All possessed genetic mutations that military scientists wanted to study. They were taken from their families, held in underground facilities, and subjected to brutal medical procedures. The screen behind Chun filled with declassified documents. Steve recognized some of the signatures, generals he'd served under, politicians who'd shaken his hand at ceremonies. They'd all known. They'd all been complicit. Patient files show that tissue samples, bone marrow, and neural fluid were extracted from living subjects. These materials were then synthesized into the serum that created Captain America. A photo appeared on screen that made Steve's heart stop. A teenage girl, maybe 16, strapped to a medical table. Her eyes were open, staring directly at the camera, filled with pain and betrayal. The caption read, "Subject 7, Enhanced Probability Manipulation Deceased." Chen's voice continued remorselessly. "This is Marie Delacroix, age 15 when she was taken from her family's farm in Louisiana. She could alter probability around her, make lucky things happen, prevent accidents. The military wanted to weaponize that ability." Steve closed his eyes, but the image burned behind his eyelids. A child who could create luck, murdered to make him lucky enough to survive impossible odds. "Subject 12, Thomas Chun, my grandfather," the lawyer continued, her composure finally cracking slightly. "He could phase through solid objects. They kept him awake during the procedures because anesthesia interfered with his abilities. He died after 3 months of torture." The room fell silent except for the sound of cameras clicking. Steve opened his eyes to see Chun holding back tears, her professional mask slipping to reveal raw pain. Captain America has been hailed as the greatest hero of our time, but his very existence is built on the bones of 17 children who never had the chance to become heroes themselves. Steve's phone buzzed with calls from reporters, politicians, and fellow Avengers. He ignored them all. How could he explain this to Tony, whose father had worked on Project Rebirth? How could he face Natasha, who knew intimately what it meant to be created through others' suffering? The press conference continued with more revelations. Medical records showed the subjects' final moments, some dying from the procedures themselves, others executed when they were no longer useful. Every death was meticulously documented in files that had somehow survived decades of cover-ups. "We call on the International Criminal Court to issue warrants for all surviving personnel involved in Operation Enhancement," Jen announced. "This includes Captain Stephen Rogers, who must have known the true nature of his creation." But that was the cruelest irony. He hadn't known. He'd gone into that chamber believing he was volunteering to become something better, something worthy of the sacrifice. Instead, he'd become a monument to atrocity, walking proof that even the purest intentions could be corrupted. His phone rang again. This time it was Tony Stark. Steve, don't watch the news. Don't read anything online. The world has gone insane. I already watched it, Steve replied quietly. Look, this changes nothing. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. Doesn't matter. Those kids are still dead because of me. No. Tony's voice was firm. They're dead because of monsters in suits who saw power and grabbed it. You were as much a victim as anyone. Steve wanted to believe that, but every enhanced ability he'd ever used, his strength, his speed, his resilience, had been purchased with innocent blood. When he threw his shield, was he channeling Marie's luck manipulation? When he survived impossible falls, was he using Thomas's phasing abilities? The families deserve justice, Steve said, and they'll get it, but not by destroying you. You've spent 80 years saving lives, Steve. That has to count for something. After Tony hung up, Steve sat in silence. Outside his window, he could see protesters gathering in the streets. Some held signs supporting him. Cap didn't know, and hero not monster. Others demanded his arrest, calling him a war criminal built on children's graves. By evening, the story had exploded across social media. #JusticeFor17 trended worldwide. Photos of the victims were shared millions of times, their stories finally being told after decades of silence. Steve read every post, memorized every face, and felt his heart break a little more with each revelation. The worst part wasn't the anger directed at him. It was the disappointment in the eyes of children who'd looked up to Captain America. Young mutants who'd seen him as proof that someone would protect them now learned that their protection came at the cost of others, just like them. As night fell over Brooklyn, Steve made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring back the 17 who died in his name, but he could ensure their deaths weren't meaningless. He picked up his shield one last time, feeling its weight differently now. Tomorrow, he would face the world and accept responsibility for sins he hadn't committed but couldn't escape. The truth had been unveiled, and there was no hiding from it anymore. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of cameras and shouting voices. Steve Rogers walked through the crowd wearing civilian clothes, dark suit, no shield, no symbol of America across his chest. For the first time in decades, he looked like just a man. Inside, the International Criminal Court had convened an emergency session. Representatives from 17 nations sat in judgment, their faces grave as they reviewed evidence that painted Captain America as a war criminal. Steve took his seat at the defendant's table, refusing the army of lawyers the government had offered him. I'll represent myself, he told them. These people deserve to hear the truth from me, not filtered through legal strategy. Judge Helena Morrison, a stern woman from Canada, called the court to order. Mr. Rogers, you stand accused of war crimes related to your participation in illegal human experimentation. How do you plead? Steve stood slowly. The weight of 17 deaths pressed down on him like gravity itself. Your Honor, I need to tell a story before I answer that question. Mr. Rogers, this is not the time for. Please. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded respect for 8 decades. These families have waited 80 years for the truth. They deserve to hear it all. Judge Morrison nodded reluctantly. Steve turned to face the gallery, where the families of the victims sat in the front rows. Their eyes held pain that time couldn't heal, anger that justice might finally satisfy. My name is Stephen Grant Rogers. I was born in Brooklyn in 1918. My father died when I was young. My mother worked herself to death trying to keep us fed. When the war came, I tried to enlist 5 times. They rejected me every time because I was too small, too weak, too sick to be useful. He paused, looking directly at Sarah Chun. I wasn't trying to become a superhero. I just wanted to serve. Dr. Erskine saw something in me. Not my body, but my character. He chose me for Project Rebirth because he believed I wouldn't abuse the power. And yet here we are. Chun interrupted from the prosecutor's table. Your power built on our children's bones. Yes, Steve said simply. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. But I didn't know. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I went into that chamber believing I was volunteering for an experimental procedure. I thought the risks were mine alone to take. He began walking along the gallery, meeting the eyes of each family member. Marie Delacroix could make miracles happen with a touch. Thomas Chin could walk through walls like they were mist. Elizabeth Torres could heal wounds with her tears. 17 young people with gifts that could have changed the world. His voice grew stronger. I've read their files. Every medical report, every death certificate, every moment of their final days. I carry their names with me now. Marie, Thomas, Elizabeth, David, Sarah, Michael, all of them. And what does that change? Called out an older man in the gallery. My daughter Jennifer died screaming in their laboratory. Your grief doesn't bring her back. Steve stopped walking. You're right. Nothing I say or do will bring back your daughter. But I can tell you what happened to the gift she died for. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I want to submit evidence of my own. Every mission report, every life saved, every moment I've used the abilities that cost these 17 their lives. For the next 3 hours, Steve detailed his 8 decades of service. Not the sanitized version from history books, but the brutal truth. Every Nazi he'd killed, every Hydra agent he'd stopped, every innocent he'd protected. The courtroom watched in silence as he painted a picture of a life spent in service to others. The Battle of New York, he continued. I used enhanced speed to evacuate civilians from collapsing buildings. That speed came from David Martinez, who could run faster than sound before they killed him at age 14. He pulled out a tablet and showed surveillance footage. Here I am catching a falling helicopter with my bare hands. That strength came from twins Marcus and Maria Santos, both 16 when they died in the laboratory. The evidence mounted like a mountain of moral complexity. Every heroic moment was tainted by its origin, but every life saved was still a life saved. I've protected thousands of enhanced individuals over the years. Mutants, inhumans, people just like your lost children. I've made sure they had rights, safety, a chance to live normal lives. I did it because I knew what it was like to be different, to be feared. Saracen stood up. But you didn't know the real reason you understood them, did you? You didn't know you carried their genetic legacy. No, Steve admitted. But I do now. And I understand why some of you want me in prison. I understand why you see me as a monument to injustice rather than a symbol of hope. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Rogers, what exactly are you proposing? Steve straightened his shoulders. I'm proposing to turn myself over to these families. Not to the government, not to any court, but to them. Let them decide what justice looks like. The courtroom erupted. Lawyers shouted objections. Family members argued among themselves. Reporters scribbled frantically. Through it all, Steve stood quietly, waiting for order to return. You can't be serious, Judge Morrison said when the chaos subsided. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Steve replied. These people lost their children to create me. They should decide what happens to me. An elderly woman in the gallery slowly stood up. Steve recognized her from the files. Margaret Torres, Elizabeth's grandmother, the woman who'd raised her after her parents died. Captain Rogers, she said, her voice paper-thin but unbreakable. My granddaughter could heal anyone with her touch. She was going to be a doctor. She wanted to save lives. Steve nodded, unable to speak. You've saved lives for 80 years. That doesn't erase what was done to create you, but it's not nothing either. She looked around at the other families. We need to talk among ourselves. We need time to decide what Elizabeth would have wanted. As the court recessed, Steve remained standing at the defendant's table. The weight of justice wasn't lighter than vibranium. It was heavier than anything he'd ever carried. But for the first time since learning the truth, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The families filed out quietly, carrying the burden of decision. Tomorrow, they would decide the fate of the man built from their children's sacrifice. Steve could only hope their answer would honor both the dead and the living. The families deliberated for 3 days. During that time, Steve remained in custody, not because he was forced to, but because he refused to leave. He spent the hours reading letters that poured in from around the world, some calling him a monster, others defending him as a victim himself. The letter that affected him most came from a 12-year-old girl named Anna, whose mutant ability to control plants had saved her family from a house fire. "Dear Captain America," she wrote in careful handwriting, "my mom says you might go to jail because of what bad people did a long time ago. I don't think that's fair. You saved my brother when the Chitauri attacked New York. He was only 5 then, and you carried him to safety while buildings fell down around you. I know you didn't want those kids to die for you. I know because you're good, and good people don't want others to get hurt. Please don't give up on being a hero. The world still needs Captain America, even if it's scary to be him right now." Steve folded the letter carefully and put it with the others. Out of thousands of messages, the child's words cut deepest because they reminded him of why he'd put on the uniform in the first place. Not for glory or recognition, but because good people stood up when others couldn't. On the third day, the families returned to court. Margaret Torres spoke for all of them, her voice steady despite her 93 years. "We've talked for 3 days and 3 nights about what justice means," she began. "Some of us wanted you in prison. Some wanted you executed. Some wanted you to just disappear and let our children rest in peace." Steve stood at attention, ready to accept whatever they decided. But then we asked ourselves a different question. We asked what our children would want. Elizabeth always said that hate was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than anyone else. Thomas wrote in his diary that he hoped his abilities could someday help protect other people like him. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. They were children, Captain Rogers, but they were children who believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed in justice, in protection, in hope, just like you did when you volunteered for that experiment. She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. "This is Elizabeth on her 16th birthday, 3 weeks before they took her. She's wearing a Captain America t-shirt. She admired what she thought you represented: sacrifice for others, standing up to bullies, protecting the innocent." The photograph showed a beautiful girl with Elizabeth's grandmother's eyes, smiling at the camera with youthful confidence. The t-shirt was faded but clearly showed the star and stripe symbol. "Our decision is this," Margaret continued. "We don't want you in prison. We don't want you to stop being Captain America. But we want something from you that might be harder than any punishment a court could give." She looked directly into his eyes. "We want you to remember them. Not just their names, but who they were. We want you to carry their stories with you every time you pick up that shield. We want their legacy to be part of yours." Steve's throat tightened. "Ma'am, I don't understand. You're not going to press charges." Saracen stood up. "We're dropping all criminal charges against you personally, Captain Rogers. But we're not done fighting. We want the truth about Operation Enhancement told in every history book. We want memorials built for our children. We want their names remembered alongside yours." Judge Morrison looked stunned. "Are you certain about this decision? You have every legal right to pursue prosecution." "We're certain," Margaret replied, "but we have conditions." She handed Steve a document. "This is a contract, not legal, moral. You'll establish a foundation in our children's names. You'll use your influence to protect other enhanced individuals from what happened to them, and you'll tell their stories every chance you get." Steve read through the document with shaking hands. It outlined a comprehensive program to support young mutants, to prevent future government experimentation, and to ensure that the 17 would never be forgotten. "I'll sign it," he said without hesitation. "There's one more thing," Margaret added softly. "We want you to visit their graves. All 17. We want you to know where they're buried, to understand that they were real people with real families who loved them." Over the next week, Steve traveled across the country, visiting 17 grave sites. Some were marked with simple headstones, others with elaborate memorials built by families who'd spent decades fighting for justice. At each grave, he left a single white rose and told their story out loud. At Marie Delacroix's grave in Louisiana, he knelt in the humid earth and whispered about every time her probability manipulation had saved civilian lives during his missions. At Thomas Chen's grave in California, he described how the ability to phase through solid matter had allowed him to rescue hostages from collapsed buildings. The hardest visit was Elizabeth Torres's grave in Texas. Her headstone read, "Beloved granddaughter, healer, dreamer." Steve placed his shield against the marker and spoke for over an hour about every life he'd saved using her healing abilities, every wound that had closed faster than humanly possible. "I know you wanted to be a doctor," he said finally. "In a way, you became one. You've helped me heal thousands of people over the years. Your gift lived on, even if you couldn't." When he returned to New York, Steve held a press conference. Standing before the world without his shield, he announced the creation of the 17 Foundation and told the true story of Captain America's origin. "I am not a self-made hero," he concluded. "I am the living legacy of 17 young people who died so that I could exist. Their sacrifice was not willing, but their gifts have been used to protect others like them. That's not justice, but it's the closest thing to redemption I can offer." The shield felt different when he picked it up again, heavier and lighter at the same time. 17 spirits rode with him now, their stories woven into his own. He was still Captain America, but he was no longer just Steve Rogers enhanced. He was Steve Rogers remembering, honoring, and carrying forward the legacy of those who'd unwillingly made him possible. The weight of honor had become the weight of memory, and that was a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. 6 months later, Steve Rogers stood before the United Nations General Assembly, but he wasn't wearing his familiar uniform. Instead, he wore a new costume, one that honored both his role as Captain America and the 17 souls whose gifts made him possible. The shield remained the same, but his uniform now bore 17 small stars arranged in a circle around the larger star on his chest. Each star was engraved with a name: Marie, Thomas, Elizabeth, and 14 others. The families had chosen the design, wanting their children remembered every time Captain America appeared in public. "Fellow delegates," Steve began, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembly hall. 6 months ago, I learned that my existence was built on a foundation of stolen lives. Today, I'm here to propose legislation that will ensure such atrocities never happen again. The Enhanced Persons Protection Act had taken months to draft. Working with the families of the 17 and leading experts in mutant rights, Steve had crafted comprehensive international law that would protect enhanced individuals from government exploitation. No enhanced person, regardless of age or nationality, can be subjected to involuntary experimentation, he continued. No government can claim ownership of someone's genetic gifts. No child will ever again die in a laboratory so that their abilities can be harvested for military purposes. The legislation was controversial. Several nations argued it would limit their sovereignty, their ability to defend themselves against enhanced threats. Steve expected the opposition. He'd faced it in committee hearings for weeks. "I understand the concerns about security," he said, turning to face the Russian delegate who'd been most vocal in opposition. "But security built on the bones of children isn't security at all. It's horror wrapped in patriotic language." Behind him, a holographic display showed photos of the 17, not as victims, but as the children they'd been. Marie laughing as she made dice land on lucky numbers for her younger siblings. Thomas playing tag with friends, phasing through trees when they tried to catch him. Elizabeth healing a wounded bird she'd found in her grandmother's garden. These were not weapons to be harvested. They were children with gifts they barely understood, taken from families who loved them, murdered for abilities they never chose to have. In the gallery, Margaret Torres watched with quiet pride. At 94, she'd insisted on attending despite her family's concerns about the long journey. She wanted to see her granddaughter's legacy become international law. The debate that followed was intense. Delegates argued about implementation, enforcement, and the definition of enhanced. Some countries threatened to withdraw from the UN if the act passed. Steve listened to every argument, answered every question, and refused to compromise on the core principles. "You're asking us to trust that enhanced individuals won't use their abilities against us," said the representative from a small European nation. "How can we be sure?" Steve's response was measured but firm. "The same way you trust that any citizen won't commit crimes, through education, integration, and the knowledge that they have a stake in the society they're part of. Isolation and persecution create enemies. Understanding and acceptance create allies." When the vote came, it passed by a single ballot. The Enhanced Persons Protection Act became international law, with enforcement mechanisms that would prevent future operation enhancements. More importantly, it established the principle that genetic gifts were not commodities to be stolen, but natural variations to be protected. After the vote, Steve walked through Central Park, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. The 17 stars on his chest caught the afternoon light, each one a promise kept. Their deaths had not been meaningless. They had become the foundation for protecting countless others. His phone buzzed with a text message from Tony Stark. "Nice work today." Cap Howard would have been proud. "Hell, I'm proud." Another message came from Anna, the 12-year-old who'd written to him during the trial. Now 13 and attending a school for enhanced students. She'd watched the UN vote on live television. "You did it, Captain America. Now kids like me don't have to be scared of the government. Thank you for keeping your promise." That evening, Steve returned to Brooklyn, to his apartment overlooking the harbor. On his desk sat 17 letters, one from each family, thanking him for giving their children's deaths meaning. He read them every night, not out of guilt but out of remembrance. Margaret Torres had written, "Elizabeth would have loved seeing her story help pass this law. She always said that dying wasn't the worst thing that could happen to someone. Being forgotten was. You've made sure she'll never be forgotten." As the sun set over New York, Steve reflected on the weight he carried. It was no longer just the weight of honor or even the weight of justice. It was the weight of memory, of responsibility, of living up to 17 legacies he'd never asked for but could never abandon. The Captain America who'd emerged from that laboratory in 1943 had been a symbol of American idealism. The Captain America who stood in his apartment tonight was something different, a guardian of the vulnerable, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, a living reminder that power must always serve those who have none. His shield leaned against the wall, the vibranium surface reflecting the 17 stars on his uniform. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new reasons to pick up that shield and stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. But tonight, he simply stood at his window and spoke their names into the darkness. Marie Delacroix, Thomas Chun, Elizabeth Torres. All 17, in the order they died, in the order they'd been taken from families who loved them. Their gifts flowed through him still, but now he understood the true source of his strength. It wasn't the serum or the stolen genetic material. It was the knowledge that 17 young people had wanted to make the world better, and through him, they finally could. The weight of honor had become the weight of legacy, and Steve Rogers would carry both for as long as he drew breath. Captain America lived on, not as a perfect symbol, but as a flawed man remembering perfect love, and that was enough. The stars on his chest glimmered like promises in the fading light, 17 lights guiding him toward a future worthy of their sacrifice. The story was complete, but the legacy would continue forever.